I'd like to acknowledge there's an absurdity and maybe even an obscenity in a media story having greater prominence than the issue of tens of thousands of desperate people risking their lives to come to Britain and this country's desperate attempts to get rid of them again. But our role in this show is to discuss the news, not make it. So here we are. So on Tuesday, to give you some background for anyone who's somehow missed this, in a reply to one of his tweets, the footballer turned sports presenter Gary Lineker told a fairly random account, one with, at the time, I think around 1,000 followers, that the government's rhetoric on migrants was being expressed in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s. As a result, he's effectively suspended from his job. Nobody is prepared to present Match of the Day at all. The government look like anti-free speech totalitarians, and the BBC is in a crisis. Rachel, is this the stupidest thing that's ever happened?
I do find it interesting how a story that has huge implications for UK politics, international law, the lives of thousands of people coming here, and basically our history and our future, has somehow turned into a story about BBC impartiality, how the BBC reports on stories about BBC impartiality, and some guy who advertises crisps.
Yep.
It is bizarre. It's also a really good example of, I think it's called the Streisand Effect.
Streisand Effect, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
which is that, I mean, it's hard for us to believe. Certainly, I need to remind myself of this sometimes, but not everyone in the country is on Twitter. Certainly not everyone is on Twitter all the time. And the number of people who probably will have seen Lineker's original comment, some, but not everyone.
Relatively microscopic.
Compared to those who have seen it on the front pages every day since then, and those who are outraged and horrified that I think that there'll be no football today, right? That's how it works.
Or like only football, but with nobody talking about it. I don't know. So I mean,
is it still football if no one talks about it?
Football, never mind. Look, I guess what I mind about this, and genuinely what I mind about this, is I see my role is to sort of like have, you know, the sideways look at the news, to talk about the trivia, unashamed about the fact that it's trivia, and put it side by side with the big stories. And it's just annoying when everyone else is doing this and doesn't seem to realise, you know, the fact that this is the big story. Grania, what do you think about this? What's your big first take?
I think part of it is the news so far, like, has been so awful and so nebulous and so confusing and so huge. And I think we're just so grateful to have a story where it's really clear. We know all the story, we know all the people involved, and it's so obvious what, you know, the position most people have on it, I think. And I think it's like Gary Lineker, he's not an indentured servant. You know, he's a sentient person who's allowed to have free will and opinions. And it's not like during Match of the Day, he was saying things like, oh, I haven't seen defence this week since the last budget. Like, it was very much in a separate context in his role as a human being. And yeah, I just think it's just pathetic that this is what we're talking about instead of, you know, a plan to deal with a refugee crisis that may contravene international human rights laws. That should be the biggest news story rather than Gary Lineker's Twitter account.
I promise we will come to the actual plan eventually. I do promise this. I have sworn to myself, and it's written down in big letters. Sticking on Gary Lineker, I think one of my problems here is I literally don't understand the argument. I'm not saying that in some sort of faux, naive kind of way. I don't get it. Impartiality is important if your job requires impartiality. I see that. If you are a political reporter, if you're a political commentator, a political analyser on the BBC, and you angrily betray your own politics on Twitter, I see how that impairs your ability to do your job, or at least impairs the extent to which people are prepared to trust you. But no one thinks Gary Lineker is going to be worse at talking about football, or less trustworthy talking about football, if we know what he thinks about the government's migrant policy, or that it should damage the BBC generally, because people from the BBC let slip their political views all the time. Like, I mean, Grant Tucker was talking this morning on The Breakfast Show, reminding us that Kenny Everett, when he was presenting a primetime BBC show, went on stage at the Conservative Party conference and said, let's kick Michael Foot's stick away. You know, I mean, like, this is not... The chairman is a former Tory donor, you know, and we accept that these people can put their politics to one side and do their jobs. And their jobs aren't just talking about football. You know, I mean, Rachel, look, am I mad?
No, I think the difference here is that Gary Lineker is popular, and that panics the government, and clearly has panicked BBC I want to say CCHQ, BBCCHQ, the people at the top, because he's popular and he's influential. And there were lots of comparisons this week with, for example, Alan Sugar, someone else who is on the BBC and has a show on the BBC, which isn't presenting news, but is a show that people watch and is a BBC show, so he gets money from that, tweeting all kinds of things about his politics and Mick Lynch, and no one seems to get upset about that. I think because no one likes Alan Sugar and people do like Gary Lineker, and that's why this is all blown up. I was keeping track, though, because I follow lots of Twitter accounts that I don't necessarily agree with, but I follow the protect free speech, cancel culture.
I'd imagine they're all over this, right?
Yeah. They are standing there in solidarity with Gary Lineker. They are calling for an apology from the BBC, and they're completely silent about it. Or indeed they are celebrating this, because actually it's really not about free speech at all. And I hate that Voltaire quote, because it gets one, misquoted, and two, really, really overused. But in this particular example, you've got a great opportunity here to defend somebody's right to free speech who you disagree with because you believe in the principles of free speech, and there has been absolute silence.
In fairness, Piers Morgan's doing it. I think not necessarily to Gary Lineker's delight. He's going, well, this is exactly like what happened with me and Meghan Markle. You can see Gary Lineker going, no. Look, so Grania, the political journalist Rob Hutton said something I thought was just fantastic. He said he wrote that so much of the last decade is Conservative MPs being caught out by other people taking their postures seriously. And I wonder if that's kind of what's going on here, that you had this sort of like great Conservative sort of swell of people going, it's outrageous, the BBC must do something about Gary Lineker. Now they actually did do something about Gary Lineker. They're like, well, hang on, we're left a bit high and dry here. I just think it's a whole hypocrisy about free speech.
I just think it's this shift of the Overton window where saying, I don't think refugees should be allowed drown in the sea. That's seen as like a controversial hot take that maybe somebody shouldn't feel comfortable tweeting. I don't know. It's Fox News. It's just culture wars. It's dog whistle. It's absolute, like, we cannot talk about any of our other policies. We've got a general election next year. What can we distract people with? That's the whole thing.
I should point out, because I got that slightly wrong first, you said it's Fox News rather than what you might have been describing it did to news, which I had a moment of shock on live radio there. But now I understand.
Akin to the in-house style of.
Yes, no, now I understand. I mean, I think it's what you say it's absolutely right, because these things sort of become binary, and you have people saying, well, you wouldn't make this kind of, people saying, well, look, if he'd said that, migrants, I don't know, if he'd said it's right to have Germany's rhetoric. If someone said migrants should drown in the sea, then you'd be all behind them getting sacked. And this is the same. It's like, no, it's not the same. And politics gets sort of, I don't know, made binary in this kind of way. Anyway, look, we will talk about this a bit more, but I think we'll probably talk a bit more about the policy as well. I should let you know, yes, we've just heard that the BBC News now understands that Alex Scott and other pundits have pulled out from the BBC's Football Focus programme this lunchtime. Sky News understands that Football Focus will not air at all, and that players will not be asked to do post-match interviews. And the PFA, the Professional Footballers Association, say that players will not be asked to do interviews in Match of the Day at all. So this is sort of growing and growing, some might say hilariously.